Okay, today I talk more about JavaScript. We do more exciting stuff using what we call vanilla. If you ever heard the term vanilla JavaScript, it's pretty much JavaScript without using any framework or library to help you out. And let's go. So I'll be using the source code we've been working on. This is the repository, and I'll be opening Visual Studio Code. If you recall, I have a source directory, src. And we have the HTML files, CSS, and now .js JavaScript files. Last time we worked on this, if I live review that, it's like that. Today I want to work on a message board application. Basically, it's like any kind of, if you go on social media today or any popular website, you always have some text box where you can type some comment or leave a message, or even if you're chatting somebody else, right? You're doing DMs via WhatsApp or e-message or whatever. You're always like, there's a box, you press the button, it submits a message, and you see the message list appear. So I want to do that, and we'll leverage some fake data to do it. So to do that, I first start by creating a file, src slash messages.html. We got to do the boilerplate. So if you forget about HTML, remember, it's always the same. You got the doc type first. If you don't remember, you can always right click any one page you have already made, and you can open that somewhere else. Let me see, view, split down, and then I can open index, and then I can recall the structure from there. Basically, less than, bang, doc type, all caps, space HTML greater than, that tells the browser we want to use HTML version 5. And then we always have the HTML tag. I always close it right away. And inside that, two things, the head and the body. So open those flags and close them. And in the head, we typically have the title tag to that will appear in the tab. Let's call that messages or message board. How about that? And then the body, we will have, let's say, H1 with message board. And then let's add a generic container. So a generic element in HTML is just a div. And let me remove my thing here. Sorry about that. Restart. There you go. Going back, we got the div, close the div. So I'll use this div as the container that will contain all the messages. So I will give it an ID, call it message list, separated by a dash. Make sure the ID has no space, okay? No spaces. Okay, so for example, I could have like a generic div like this with some message, hello world there. And then to make it pretty, we can add a class here. Let's call it message list item. How about that? And then we can define the CSS later. Okay, let me preview this. So as we go through, we can see it look what it looks like. So if you recall, what I use is Visual Studio Code's extension called Live Preview. So if you haven't have installed that yet, you can do a search for Live Preview. Install the one for Microsoft, and here you can go to View, Command Palette, and type Live Preview, Show Preview internal browser. That's what I use right now. Or you can open this file in the browser of your choice. Okay, so we got the message board there. I want to make this have a style. Otherwise, I don't know if I have like multiple, for example, if I copy this by highlighting and pressing Alt Shift down, now I have two messages, but I cannot distinguish one from the other. Obviously, I know it is different, but maybe the person wouldn't know. So I want to add some CSS. So typically we add a new file. Let's call it messages.css. I will open it at the bottom here so we can kind of code along. So I want to define the styles for these elements that have the class message list item. So I say dot, that means we want to target elements that have the class message list item all separated by a dash. And I want to add some border first. 1 pixel solid black. Remember, I'm using the shorthand property for CSS that takes 3 values in this case, the first for border width, and then for border style, and then for border color. Of course, you can always do 3 separate properties, but that's just too tedious to write them out. Okay, let's see how it goes. Now remember, we can write it here, but our HTML5 doesn't know about it, so we have to link it. So to link CSS, we typically go to the head and locate the end tag, the closing tag. So before that, we add a link tag, right? And inside as an attribute, remember attributes in HTML, we add to the right-hand side of a open tag name. And rel is a style sheet. And then we got href. And you have to provide the path to the CSS file. In this case, it's relative, so in the same directory as messages.html. So I can just say that. And it works off the bat. Because link is a self-closing tag, I don't have to say the less than slash link greater than. Okay, that's great. I want to add some space inside, right? That's called a padding, if you recall from CSS. Let's add a padding, shorthand property for the top, right, bottom, and left. So that's 16 pixels there. If you want to decrease, you could maybe 8, looks like that, or 12 looks like that. You choose whatever you want. Remember, you can always open the DevTools and calibrate to your heart's content. Something I also want to do is maybe I want to space them out. I don't like them together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the parent and I'm going to add a class, message list. Now notice the class is the same as the ID. So I could technically use the ID, but I don't want to make it a generic thing. So you could have like multiple ones on a page because the ID is unique. There can be no other element with that. So and the reason I do that is simply to separate them out. This is a technique I often use. Basically, if I want to space out the elements in a certain container or list, I actually go to the parent to do that. So as long as the parent has this class, I can target it like this with a selector. For example, if I have the class message list, but I want inside of that, I want all the elements that have the class message list item to have margin bottom, for example, 16. And that would add a margin bottom to each of them. That way I don't have to do for each one of this because the reason I don't put that in list item is because the way I think about user interface or UI, I think of it as a piece, some piece that I can kind of plug into wherever it could be. So this message doesn't necessarily have to be part of this whole list. It could be elsewhere. But in that elsewhere, in that context, the spacing it would be the different, right? So that's why I always delegate the spacing between items in a list to the parent. Okay. And I guess we can now add some more stuff. Border radius to make it rounded. 4 pixels is a little rounder there. And you can add more stuff as you see fit. We don't have much time to go over that, so you're welcome to add your own styles. Okay, let me save everything. Another message. How about that? And then let's add a third one here. I'll copy by highlighting it and Alt Shift down arrow. Oops, my keyboard just changed. Okay, now that's great. Now let's add here. So if you want to add a text box that's multiple lines for the user to type a comment or message, that's usually the text area element. So before at the top, I'll add text area like this. And I have to close it because it's not self-closing. So you can see there's a multi-line text there. And then you're going to add some button. Uh, let's say write or send message about that, write message. And then we enclose this in a form like this. If you recall HTML forms, so enclose that in a form. Let's give it a name for the text area. Let's call it a message. Actually, my gotta think message content. Text. Gotta think about names because usually messages might be too broad. Because I'm thinking ahead. Usually messages have more metadata about not only what the person said, but who sent the message. It could have an ID identifier of the message, when the message was written, all this stuff. So that's what's going on in my head as I'm thinking about the name. So it probably would be better to call this content or something, or comment, something like that. Anyway, that's okay for now. Okay, so we got that, but we won't do this just yet. This is just a placeholder. So you can kind of make it better, maybe add a class there to add a space under it, but I want to focus on this part here, the messages. So let's go a step further. So what we're going to do ultimately is read these messages. Hello world, another message, and hey, from a backend server. So usually what happens is when you have a website, and you have all these comments, those comments are stored somewhere. And it's somewhere called the backend. In the backend, there's a database, and the database holds all that information. So in order for that to get to the user, the client in the browser, so the browser will make what's called a HTTP request to ask for that information to a backend server. That server will be responsible for asking the database for the data and then giving it back to the user. It's like a middleman of sorts. Obviously, the server usually has to check first if the user is authenticated into the system, and later if the user has permission or authorization to do that operation. So you have to keep in mind in actual app, those things are happening behind the scenes. Okay, but ignoring all that stuff for now, so we're just gonna focus on retrieving the data. So before I do that, we have to understand how can we hold the data first in JavaScript so that we can later ask the server for it. But we all kind of already learned about that. If you recall from our previous exercise, we had a kind of image gallery where you click next to go and you change the image. We learned about arrays there. It's a way of storing all the image URLs. And this is precisely how we're going to store the comments. It's basically an array or list of things. Okay. We could initially have a list of strings, just like the images here. That's totally fine. So let's get to doing that first. And then once you establish that in JavaScript, what's going to happen is we have to manipulate the document and construct all of these divs using JavaScript. So right now we have a declarative approach in the sense we kind of declare all of them here. But when the user loads the website, there's no way of you knowing exactly what these messages are because they're dynamic. They're always changing, right? Somebody could be commenting right now, another person. So it's always going to change every second, every millisecond. So we have to ask the server for the information and build the list ourselves. So that's the challenge here. And later on, as we learn about React, we kind of invert that paradigm and let the library or framework do all of this building for us. And then we can go back to being declarative. But for now, we have to be programmatically, in the sense we have to write every single piece of code. Basically, we're going to build a div. We're going to add the class. We're going to change the text content. And then finally, we're going to inject into this list, something like that. Okay, let's create a JavaScript file for this messages HTML, messages.js. I usually name the file so with the same name, a prefix, so it's easy to know which one corresponds to what. And then let me put it down here so it's easy for you to see. Okay, so first I want to go here and link these two. Usually in the case of JavaScript, people like to add before the end of the body. Whereas CSS is before the end of head, JavaScript usually end of body. So we add a script here. Source will be messages.js because it's relative path. And don't forget to close it because it's not self-closing. And then what I'm going to do is in the JavaScript file is I want to first hold all these messages somehow. And remember, when we do JavaScript and you have literal characters, you have to start them in strings, which is a sequence of characters. So the way you do that is with quotes. Could be single, double, or backtick. Let me use single. Let's do hello world. That's the first, right? And then we got another message like that. And then we got hey here. Now, you have to follow the JavaScript syntax. You cannot just write them like this. So we're going to create an array. If you recall, arrays are created with a square brackets between the things you want to hold, and then you have to separate them with a comma like this. And let me break a line so it's easier for you to see, but it doesn't matter if you have space. Could be just everything in one line. And I always like to add to the beginning of line, every time I either open colored lace, square brackets, or open a tag, we add the what's called indentation, which is at least two spaces. And it's going to look like this. And then we store this array in a variable. Let's call it messages. And JavaScript, it's optional to end a statement with semicolon, but I always add it just in case. There might be some problems in some situations, but most of the time you don't need it. Okay, so this is pretty much the concept from last class, right? An array is a sequence or list of things. In this case, we have this list or array of three elements separated by a comma, and each element is a string. A string is a sequence of characters. And we hold them in a variable. If you recall, the right-hand side gets stored as a reference through the messages word. And the reason for having const is we only define this once. You don't have to, you will not redefine it. So if you want to redefine it, you have to use let. Okay, now we got to build this thing. So how do we build a div? Well, you got to use document as the document for something. If you recall, we use get element by ID to find something and query select or get elements by class name. Now the document object, if you press dot, has a lot of other things. And one of them is create element. So it can literally create something new for you. And it's a function. So create element being a function, you need to execute the function, ask for the instructions to be run. And every time you have that, you have to have the parentheses. Now, between the open and close parentheses, you give the input to the function if it needs any at all. In this case, as you can see from Visual Studio Code, it gives me some helper text here that tells you what the argument the function expects. In this case, it's the name of the tag. So if you want to create a div, you would pass the name div in quotes because it has to be a string. Remember, if you don't have quotes, it will interpret that as something special, like a variable. In this case, messages doesn't have quote because it's a special thing. It's a variable that holds this in memory. So whenever you say messages, it's actually pointing to this. Okay, so create a div. That's nice. So we want to kind of add stuff to that div. So let's keep that in a variable so we can do stuff with that later. So let me do a variable here. Let's call it div element equals, and then we add the const for syntax. And I like my semicolons at the end of the statement. Now, whenever I reference div element, it will get the actual div that was created in memory. Now, I have to keep in mind when I create element, it is creating in memory, meaning it's not yet in the document. So the user won't see that. So we only do that at the end after building everything, after adding the class and the text content. Now, to add the text content, you'd say change the property of this div element. So if you think of div element as an object, it has attributes, and one of them is class. And then we have another one, which is the thing between the tags, and that's usually called, if in the world of React, that I was going to learn later, it's the children. But in this case, it's the text content. So we can say div element dot text content to access whatever's between the tags. Now, in this case, I don't have anything. It's empty because if you recall, we created a div. So we want to assign something to that. And that has to come from this here. But if you recall, if I want to access this first element, I would say messages brackets, and then you have to give the index, which is the position in the array. So you always start counting from zero. So zero index is hello world, one is another message, and two is hey, right? I always have to subtract one, right? If it's first element, that's one minus one, zero index. So if I were to do the first one, I put zero there, okay, to get the text hello world replaced here. Obviously, I can hard code it, but I want to work through the exercise because things will come from an array eventually later on. Anyway, we got that down. Now we can add a class by doing div element dot class list. So if you access the class list, we can call on that to add. So you have to say dot add like this. You see, it's always like the dot notation, right? If you recall in the very first exercise we did, we could change the style, right? By saying the element dot style dot some CSS property name in camel case. Here's kind of the same concept. So here we're accessing the list of classes this element has. Obviously, it's empty in the beginning, so we're going to add a new one called message list item. So what I'm doing here is rebuilding this, but except in JavaScript. Instead of declaring HTML, I'm doing JavaScript. So first I create the element, I assign the text content, which is this, and then finally add the class, which is that one. Now that we got that down, we have to finally inject that into the list. So we would go and find this div element and append to that. When I say append, it's add to the end of the list of children. Okay, so we're gonna call document get element by ID message list. Recall if this get element by ID, we'll go through the document and find this div here because it matches the ID we pass as the argument to the function. And then from that, we're gonna append child, which means it's gonna take something as input and add to the end of this list of children here. Okay, so we're gonna do div element there. And if you look here, what happened, right? It added hello world down here. So that's what it's doing. Now we have to repeat this for every single one of them. Okay. But that's tedious to do. Like, I just copy the same code, right? I copy this and I have to do message sub one to access another message. And then I copy this and have to message sub two to get hey. By the way, let me remove these so you know it's actually being there. So I remove all of them here. Okay, so I would have to copy and paste. Now the reason it's giving an error because I redefined div element. So I would have to make that let to define it again under the same name. Otherwise, you have to call it div element 1, 2, and 3, so on. So let me do let, and then you remove this so you're redefining it. So if you do it that way, you can see hello world is there. Another message is there. Hey is there. But it's tedious. Imagine if we have like thousands of them and we don't even know how many there are because we're going to retrieve from backend server. So we have no way of knowing that. So what we do is when we have this kind of repetitive stuff is we got a loop, LOOP, repetition. Okay, so we got to go through all these messages one by one and do something of that, and which is basically the same code over and over. We just change the index here. That's all we change. Okay, so let's see what we can do here. So I'm gonna go and delete all this repetitive stuff, move this back to const. Now we're gonna loop or repeat something. We're gonna use the for loop. Now there are different kinds of for loops. The one I'm gonna use is a simple one called a for of, okay? So for a value of something, in this case, for a value of a list, that is a list item. So let's do it. For a const message of messages. So what I'm saying is I want you to repeat the following between the curly braces for every message. So what's going to happen is going to take the array, which is messages, And then first it's gonna take hello world. It's gonna store that in message. So imagine there's hello world there. And then it's gonna do whatever you specify between the curly braces, which is this, right? And it's gonna do that 3 times because there's 1, 2, 3 elements. So it's gonna do as many elements as it has. Now, if you notice, they already did the loop there. 1, 2, 3, but it all have hello world because there's always messages sub 0. So I want to change this to actually be what? Message, because message is holding the element. So if you just change that to message, it will be hello world on the message and hey. So the first repetition is with message being the value hello world. The second repetition is message being having the value another message. The third and final one is the one having the value hey. Because we have finished all the elements, it doesn't repeat anymore and continues for all the other code after this statement here. Okay, so that's the for of loop. So it's always the same pattern. For parentheses, constant name of the variable that will hold every element in every iteration of some sort of list, many things. Okay, so what changes is this. You can give any name you want, and what changes is the right-hand side of or. You can give any name. It has to be the variable you want to iterate or run through. And then you can use message here to access all of these. Okay, now I want to think about, usually a message has a person who wrote it. There's the date it was posted and many other kind of data. So just the text is not sufficient to hold this. So we got to make it better. How can we hold more information here? So I got to teach you about objects. So let's go to the browser. So let me teach you about objects. So we learned about arrays. It's just a way to holding sequence of data. Can we hold arbitrary kinds of data? Like make a structure where we can hold, like, say, I want to store the author of the post, the message, the ID of the post. I want to store the date it was created and so on. So for that, we create objects. Now, to create an object, simple. In JavaScript, if you see curly braces like this, it's an object in itself. So let's call this obj. And then objects, they hold a key value pairs. So what, for example, if I want to hold that message, I could say the name of the key, which is could be message, and then colon the value. Let's say hello world, like this. Okay, so this is an object with the properties message having the value hello world. Now you can hold more information. You can add a comma and then repeat the same pattern. Let's say I add an author, random person, like that. So property name, colon, and then the value. You notice the property name, you don't have to add quotes. That's optional. However, the value is a string in this case, so you need to have quotes. The value could actually be something else like another object or even an array. And you can keep going like that. Maybe you want created at, like the date it was created. You can give it a name like that. In this case, it's going to be a date. So usually we use the date object for this. Or typically it's stored in the backend just as a string in a certain format, like 2024, 09. And then there's just some pattern there, T, whatever, something like that. Anyway, press enter and you see the file. I'm using Firefox and same thing, Chrome. You'll see it allows me to expand this and see each pair of property and value. Now, when you talk about object-oriented programming, you're also going to hear these properties being attributes of an object, okay? So how do I access information like the message from this object? So like the array we use square brackets, you can actually use that for objects too. If you do like objects square brackets, and then you give the property name as a string. You can do that, and it will access the value that's in the property message. But many people like to use the dot notation, which is obj dot, the name of the property, like this. And this dot notation is the thing that we've been using so far when we do document dot get element by ID, and then dot style or dot class list. It's because we're accessing a property of an object. Okay, that's why we use the dot. So now you know where that comes from. So basically somebody defined the document object. You have that style object and class list object and so on. Okay, so if you were to access the author, you would say the name of the variable that holds the object dot author, which is the property name, and that will give you a random person. And finally, to get the created at dot created at. And all these property names are arbitrary, by the way. I just chose them, but you can choose any name you want for your property. Obviously, you want to be descriptive and choose a name that makes sense, right? You don't want to name things A, B, and C. Otherwise, you don't know what the heck they are meant for. Okay, now you know about objects. Let's improve our code. So let's add something better here. So for each message will not be a string, but an object. So I add curly brace here to each. And then that has to be a part of a property that I'll call message. Now you see why I was a bit skeptical of putting message. Otherwise, we have like message dot message, which is weird. But you could choose another name if you want. Anyway, if you want to put author, you can do it here, but might be awkward later. I'll leave it out. You get the point. Let's add an ID. That could be something interesting. Usually there's an identifier for each. You see that a lot. Its records come from the backend because two messages could have the same content, but you don't know which one is which. So that's why there's always a unique identifier ID. I'm just adding that to get you used to it. Okay, add a curly brace, ID 3, message colon, close the curly brace at the end. People usually like also to kind of write it this way. Seems clearer to them. I like it too. Basically, they open curly brace and have one property and key property value for line. That's also nice notation. Easy to see. By the way, in the JavaScript, you can have an optional comma here. So you might see a lot people adding commas at the end of the last element, but it's optional. And the reason for always adding it is for version control, Git, like we learned. Whenever you add something new property, you would always have to add a new comma here, so it create kind of diff noise. So it would change the previous line even though nothing really changed, just adding a comma. Anyway, that's a bit more lines, but easier to see. Now, because we have this new structure for messages, we now have a list or array of objects, no longer strings. So here, when we say message here, line 16, we're iterating over objects, not strings. Therefore, the text content here has to change to message object dot message property value, which will point to this. Okay, and then we should fix the problem here. Okay, nice. Now let's do something here. How about we write some message there, handle it. How about we do that? Let's see. So I want to be able to type something here and click write message and add to this list. Now, this is usually what happens is you click write message, it makes a request to the server and asks the server, hey, I want to post this message, hello. And then the server will decide, do you have permission to do this? If so, I will change the database and insert that new message. And then that's it. You can update your front end and let the user know there's a new message here at the end. Because I don't want to do the back end yet. I want to just show you how you can do right away, adding that message without back end. So what we got to do is we got to go to this form. We got to handle an event on submit here. So remember, we handle on click. When you click something, do whatever I told you to do in this function definition. It's kind of the same, except is when I click the submit button, which is this one. You see this as type submit. That's important because this is the button designated as submit button, and that would trigger the submit event. So let's create a function here. Let's call add message. That will be the name of the function, and remember parentheses there. Then what we're going to do is go to the JavaScript part, define the function add message like this. Remember, thus keyword function followed by space and then the name of the function, parentheses, and you got to define the inputs, but we don't have any right now, so I leave empty, and then the instructions to be executed from the top to the bottom between the curly braces. Now, what's going to happen is first I got to learn what the user typed. So to do that, I got to capture this text area value. So if we go to the text area here, we need to be able to get that using JavaScript. One way is by ID. Let's add an ID. I'll call it message form message. I know it's weird. I put message there again. So I'm going to get this ID. I'm going to go here to add message and say document.get element by ID, parentheses, quotes, and then paste that same ID. So this is going to get this text area. Now, provided it exists, obviously, usually I'm always doing happy path, which means I'm not handling any kind of errors. What if that element didn't exist for some reason? So I'm not handling that, but usually we have to do it. We have to check if the element is present, it's not undefined, then you can continue. Otherwise, stop trying to add the message. Okay, so let's hold this in a variable. Let's call it text area element. How about that? And typically, if you want to test if it exists or not, you can just do like this. If text area element return. So what I wrote here is it's called an if statement. So basically, if whatever's between the parentheses is a true expression, truthy, I want you to execute everything between the curly braces. Now, when you have text area element defined, it will be like an object. But if it's not, it will be something not defined or null. Okay, so that is what's called a falsy value. So it's in this exclamation as a logic not. So basically, if text area element is like no or undefined, it would invert or flip that undefined to a truthy, which would be true. And these values are called Booleans. Let me talk more about that. Might be confusing to you. So in JavaScript, we have what's called Boolean values, which is false and true. So basically, they just mean something is true or something is false. Now, there's some values in JavaScript that can be considered false. They're the falsy ones. And that's what kind of makes some people hate JavaScript because it's not so strict. So if you have empty string, that's falsy. And if you have null, that's falsy. And if you have undefined value, it's false. Okay, so if you tried, for example, document get element by ID, I don't exist, it gives me null. Now, if I take null and I put a bang before that, that means it's going to invert or flip that. So null is falsy. So the opposite of false is true, which is true. So that's why it gives me true there. Now the mechanism I use there is to just to check, okay, if I don't find anything, that means if it's true, I want return from the function not do anything at all. So that's what I'm doing there. Okay. So if this is true, return. Return is a key word to return from a function. Usually return something back, but if you don't have anything, it can be empty return. And it immediately stops the function. Everything after the curly brace will not be executed. So that's the point here. So if I don't find a text error element, I don't do anything. That's the point. That's the handling of the error, okay? But obviously here we are going to find it. We are very sure it exists. But anyway, enough about that. So we're going to take text area element, and there's a property called value, the attribute. That's whatever the user typed. And we got to take that and then do the same thing we did here, pretty much copy and paste this code. But instead of message.message, we got to pass text area element.value. Now, if I have repeated code, I don't want to repeat myself. Again, I can actually isolate these instructions into a function and then call that function to do whatever we need that to do. Okay, so bear with me. So what we're going to do is define a function here. Let me see. We already have add message. That makes naming hard. Let's say, let's call it append message or add message to list. How about add message to list? How about that? This function will actually take an input. It's something that's always changing these instructions here. Let me copy them between the curly brace. Is this part here? And that's actually what I want to take as the input because it's always changing. So the input here will be the message itself. So I can say message text, right? How about it? Or just message, whatever. Let's just call it message. And then here I get access to the message object, and that will work just fine because I named the same here. Now this name could be something else, right? You could name this something. You have to name this something, okay? Just confusing having the property name the same, but it's like that. Okay, now from here, I would call add message to list with that argument. So what's happening, okay, you have a function, you're calling it with this input or argument. This value here will become this parameter here. So you can imagine that is there, okay? And then from there is going to go here, something like that. All right. But there's a very small detail. It expects to be an object. So this has to be an object, not just a string. So we have to actually build an object here with the message property like that. So it works off the bat. Otherwise, I have to change the definition of a function. Okay, and because we're using the same thing, we can also change this to that. But before that, let's just test if it's working, because we don't want to do too many things at the same time. So I change this, I add message. Let's say working. Let me see. ABC, write message. So something's not right. What's going on? Let's go to the browser to debug. I'll teach you how to debug. So I'm going to open an external browser here. I'm going to use Chrome for the debugging, by the way, for the Chrome people. Give me one moment. I open slash messages.html. Okay, let's go, Chrome people. F12 to see the dev tools. So to debug JavaScript, you're going to click the sources tab. In Firefox, it might be called debugger tab or something like that. And you can see you can either control P and look for the file like messages.js, or you can click the side here. And what I want to test is, okay, what's going on? Every time I click add message, it's not working. You know, what is going on? So let's first think about this. So the first thing I expect is when I click write message is it submits the form. So when it's going to call add message. So I think I know what's going on right away, because if I type ABC, try message, I notice everything got wiped out. And that's because the default behavior of the form is to make a get request, if you recall from an HTML lecture. And you can see there's an actual something added to the URL there, query parameter. So I already figured it out even without the dev tools, but basically you would go to here, sources, and where you have add message, you put a what's called a breakpoint. So here's the function I expect to be executed. So I click here, and next time I try this, it's gonna stop the code, the program right there. So you see it stopped, and then kind of go run through it. If I press to go to the next line, is this arrow here, or F12, sorry, F10. And now it's in the next line. So I can hover over text area element and I can see the value is null. Okay. So right away, something is weird. So get element by ID. It's not finding message form message. Why? Let's go to elements, look at the form. Oh, I don't have the ID here. Why not? That's weird. So let's go and check it out in our code. I'm back here. I don't know why, but I wrote ID here and it's not appearing. Did I save my file? I sure did. I control S. Oh, look what I did. I wrote the attribute in the closing tag. So that is wrong, right? So I take this out of here. I have to make it to the open tag, not the closing one. So I do that, save it. Then I'm going to go back to the browser. I'm going to refresh. I should expect the ID to be here now. See that? And then I'm going to try again to ABC, write a message. Next line with F10, hover over text area. Now it's finding it. You can see it highlighted in the content. So the element is there. That's good. We already fixed the problem. I had my ID attribute in a closed tag for text area, which is wrong. Attributes are always defined on the open tag right-hand side of its name. Okay, great. Now, if I go down, if I look at text area element dot value, it's ABC. You see, I'm hovering over everything and it tells me what it is. So if I hover text area element, that's the whole object of all these property and values. And if I hover over value, it gives me the actual ABC. Let me show you here. This is the object. And if I go all the way down to value, somewhere there is ABC. You see that? Value has the property. Value is the property and its value is ABC. Okay, so that is expected. I think it's going to work. However, the form is going to submit to the server in a traditional way. So going to reload a page, which is going to mess everything up. But if you notice very quickly, it actually did add to the end. It's just that it reloaded the page. So we have to prevent it from being reloaded. So to prevent the default reloading behavior, you have to go to message.js. And here in the beginning of add message, the handler function for the form submission event, you have to say, stop doing what you are told to do by default. Now, to do that, we need to access the event parameter that's always passed into event handler functions. Now, add message actually can take an input called the event object. And then from that event object, you have to say prevent default like this. So it's a method or function of the event object, so dot here. And if you call that, it's just basically going to tell the form, don't reload the page. I want you to stop doing that. But for this to work, you have to go to line 9 in the HTML and add event here. Literally add the word event there. Otherwise, it's not going to work, okay? Now let's test it out. I will go to Google Chrome again and debug it. Let me refresh. ABC, click write message. It triggers the onSubmit function. I can go and keep doing everything. I expect it to be okay, right? No problem there. And I actually can step into this function if you want to learn how the object is built. I can step into this function by using this one, F11. So let's do that. It's going to go into add message list. And let's run each statement. Let's first create the div. Now I have the div here. You hover over that. There's no text content. If you scroll down, see the text content empty here. So we're going to change that in the next line. So let's go. By the way, message here is an object with the property message, value ABC. So expect message dot message to be ABC. Let's next line, F10. Now, what's the div now? What's the text content? Let's see, ABC here. And finally, let's go to the class list. Let's look at a class list. Oh, there's one now. It's like an array. It's called a DOM token list. So if you look at div element, you can access it through the class list somewhere here. See class list, you can expand. And you see there's one element, index 0, which is message list item. Oh, so that's working fine. I'll just let it play. But before I do that, let me just remove the breaking point. I can either go to where it was and click here. Again, the same line. Or I think on the right-hand side, there's somewhere with the breakpoints. This one, I think you can trash it. Or you can right-click, remove all breakpoints. And then play. And close this. And it's ABC there. Let me zoom in for you. And I can try the write message. Great. However, I would like to remove this when I submit, right? That's what usually happens. So for that, we got to change the value attribute of the text area after we submit. So if you quickly go there, add message. After adding the message to the list, we're gonna take the text area element, dot value, and assign a new thing that's to clear it is basically an empty string, right? Equals empty string, which is basically two quotes, either double or single. So that way, when I say def, write message is added to the end, and then finally clears the text area. Like that. Okay, so that's the submission there. Obviously, we don't have a backend. So what would happen is first is before you add message to the list, you would, there's two approaches, right? There's the optimistic approach, which is basically add it to the list right away and expect the server will accept it in the backend. And then if it doesn't accept, we can remove it from the list. If it does accept it, we don't do anything. We are optimistic about it. The other approach is only add when you're sure the server accepted it. So in that case, obviously, when you get a response, all okay, you would add, right? But there's always before here, actually call a backend server and submit the message. So we have to do that. All right, I think that's it for this lesson. I'll see you on the next one.